Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Life on the Chesapeake Bay has been told through a new novel about a waterman and his daughter. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The novel Still Water Bending by Wendy Clark tells the story of Gines Arley Evans, a waterman on the Virginia Western Shore, and his daughter, Lily Ray, who comes home after he has a stroke. Wendy Clark is no stranger to the tales of those who plow the waters of the bay. She has written extensively about the region over the years, including becoming the executive editor for the Chesapeake Bay magazine. In her novel, Clark captures the hard life of watermen and the tides of change that have swept over the region. And she's in our studio this morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So what inspired you, first of all, to write this novel? And then I understand you really, generally speaking, you're just writing nonfiction. You do lots of magazine work and so on. What spurred you to enter the world of fiction?
Well, I'd always wanted to write a novel. Everybody wants to write a novel, right?
Right.
And I, originally went to college thinking I was going to major in creative writing, and that's not how it turned out, and that's not how life turned out. So, I'd always wanted to do it, essentially. And when I found my subject, I started.
So what inspired you for these particular characters? I understand that you based some of it on some of the people you've known.
Yeah, the characters came about because of a story that I'd actually written for my first nonfiction book, which is called Window on the Chesapeake, which was published in 2002, I think, by the Mariners Museum. And that was a series of essays about the bay. And one of the essay subjects was a waterman down in Bayvon, Matthews County, Virginia, named Walter Coles Burroughs. And I spent the day with him pound net fishing, and I was going to just write a typical sort of profile story about him. But at the end of the day, when we came in off the water, he invited me into his kitchen to sit down and just talk. And he clearly didn't want me to leave, and he clearly just wanted to talk about sort of things other than fishing and his life. And he was very sad because he had lost his wife. And I came away from it just sort of compelled by the melancholy of the man. And so he sort of stuck in my head. And I wrote this profile story about him that did run in Chesapeake Bay magazine. It was part of my book. Then it got picked up by a journal of creative nonfiction called River Teeth. Won a bunch of awards. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever written. And then because I always wanted to write fiction, I knew about the Breadloaf Writers Conference in Middlebury, Vermont. And to me, that was Mount Olympus. If you could get into Breadloaf, you were writing with the gods. And so, but I had no fiction. And to apply, you have to submit a chapter of work that you're working on. And so I said to myself one day, thinking about it, well, why don't I just take that story, which is still very compelling to me, and turn it into a fiction? So I took that essay and I created, I basically fictionalized it a little bit. Completely rookie move, but it was enough to get me into Breadloaf. And then the story and the characters, grew out of that.
So tell me, set up for our audience a little bit about what the story is, because it opens, I guess, with the Gines' stroke, and then obviously then shifts to his daughter. Set that up for us.
Well, Gines has been living in the same point on the same river for his whole life, and his generations before him, his forefathers before him also. And he never wants to leave this place. It's who he is. It's what he is. But he has lost his wife. He has lost his young son. And when he lost his wife, his daughter was still pretty young, and he just kind of shut down, and he could not be a real father to her. He pretty much emotionally abandoned her. As soon as she graduated high school, she left. And so he's been alone now for 14 years, living in this big old house and fishing every day and living his life. And so he kind of lives with ghosts. And so the story opens with him sort of giving some of this background, and he goes out fishing, and on the way in, he has this stroke. And then in the second chapter, we're introduced to his daughter, who's up in Maine. She's a journalist with the Associated Press, and she's pretty bitter, pretty guarded, walled-off human being. Not surprising, considering where she came from. She gets the call, "You're his only kin. You have to come back and help." And so this is what makes the two of them collide again. She has to come back to Virginia, to this place that she never ever wanted to go back to this man she never wanted to be around again. And it's how she copes with that, and how he copes with her, and how they navigate that situation that the story unfolds.
Now, you talk a little bit about, she thinks about how the area has changed, the region has changed, and you write that many of the new people would begin to want Ophelia to be something different than it was, all the while proclaiming how much they loved it for what it is. Tell me a little bit about that. It's almost as if the region becomes another character in this book.
The sense of place, I believe, is a primary character in this book. And I wanted it to be really alive to people the way it is for me. Yeah, I mean, we've all seen it, right, on the Chesapeake and elsewhere, where you have a rural, beautiful community that lived sort of traditional ways, particularly on the bay. It has to do with living on the water and watermen's communities. And then as time has gone on and things have changed, these properties have become very valuable. Everybody wants to live on the water, and so they're coming into these areas and they're paying top dollar for these homes, and property values are going up, and people can't afford them, can't afford their taxes. So there's that enormous cultural shift going on, and part of the story is about how this community is managing or living with that cultural shift.
So, as a matter of fact, we see a little bit of that because there's at one point in the book where he's minding up these medical bills, and there's a real estate guy who comes by, sounds pretty slick, and hey, you can solve all your problems.
That's right. He comes to her daughter. This real estate agent comes to her daughter and says, look, Pop's not in such good shape, and winter's long, and maybe the thing to do here is to sell off this piece of property, and you can take care of all the bills, and you can go live in Florida, and everything will be fine. And of course, she is pretty practical, and she wants out. She wants to get everything solved so she can go back to Maine. So she starts entertaining this notion that, yeah, maybe this would work. And even if we just sold a little piece of it, that would work. And she broaches the subject with her father, who, of course, rejects it out of hand and says, "This is my home. This is my place. Evanses have lived here for generations. And as long as I'm alive, that's only Evanses are going to live here." And so he digs in his heels about this, and becomes kind of another point of contention for them.
Yeah, I mean, is there a certain sense of denial about his current circumstance in the future, in the sense that obviously the bills are piling up? I think you note at one moment that he doesn't open up the mail. He doesn't open up these bills. I mean, is there a denial about what lies in front of him?
I think Gines is afraid. Gines is he's had a pretty tough life, and everything he's loved has slipped away, and that includes his home. And so the idea that he would have to give up this last piece, this actual dirt, the dock, the water, the house, all the ghosts, that scares him very badly, and so. Yeah, I think he's in deep denial about what's happening to himself physically. He's a powerful man who's been rendered almost helpless. That scares him. What's going to happen in the future scares him. There's a exchange when he's in the rehab center, and he ends up being a roomie with this other fellow who was he was in the Menhaden fleet for many years. His name was Linwood, and he sort of watches what happens with Linwood and swears that that's not going to be his fate. He's not going to allow himself to just be shuffled off to some home somewhere and stuck in a corner to die. So he's looking at the end of his life, and he's scared. Yeah.
In some ways, some of these themes are really sort of this disappearance of a way of life? Do you think?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes, and as the story goes on, it's told in two voices. It's told in Giles's voice and it's told in Lily's voice, two points of view that alternate back and forth. And as the story develops, Lily's voice starts to take over. Hers becomes more dominant. Giles's starts to vanish, and that's sort of a metaphor for the entire story. He's going away, and his world is kind of going away, and she's gonna step into his place.
yeah, they do seem to reach out to one another when they start building the skiff. Who's motivating that? I mean, whose idea is that? Are they both going towards that object at the same point, or is somebody initiating it? How do you?
Well, the idea, the concept that I wanted to get across here is something that I've actually seen happen where, when you have two people who have a very complicated, difficult relationship and they reach a point where they just can't even talk to each other. There's just so much baggage in the room. And that's sort of where they are right when the story begins. That's where they are. And yet, if two people can find a common language outside of that, I've seen them be able to communicate around all of that baggage. They come in from a different point of view. They're focusing on something else. And it's kind of miraculous when it can happen because it gives you a place to begin to talk again. So I wanted to illustrate that, and the fact that Giles is a boat builder also provided the avenue to do that. The idea behind building the skiff, he was going to build the skiff years ago, but he just didn't get around to it. And then one night out in the shed. He's gone out to the shed and he's just sitting there because he can't sleep. And she comes out looking for him and, they start talking and she starts rooting around and she finds this pile of this extraordinary stack of beautiful cedar hiding under a tarp. And she says, "What's this for?" And he says, "That was going to be for a skiff." And she says, "Well, why don't you build it?" And so the idea was sort of hers to keep him busy because at this point he can't go fishing anymore. He's too sick. But he can't just, as he says, I can't just sit here and knit doilies. So, he's got to work with his hands. So her concept was, why don't you go build it? He goes out in the shop to try. He starts thinking about it and he says, maybe not such a bad idea after all. And he goes out into the shop to try and realizes that he's going to need help. And so he has to ask her because she's the only person that he can ask. And she acquiesces. So they end up finding this common project, common ground in this shed around building the skiff, and that's where they begin to find a language they can speak together.
What do you think that he learns from that experience? What does he get out of this joint effort? Because at one point she's basically now doing most of the work. He's kind of sitting there.
Yeah. For me, for Gines is honoring his past, building this skiff. He's honoring everything that he cares the most about, and his ability, his skill, which I should mention, all of those parts of the book are pretty precisely accurate because I spent a lot of time with a boat builder in Reedville named George Butler, who let me be a fly on his wall in his shop and watch him build this skiff. So the process, the terminology, the method, even the planer that figures in here was in his shop. So what I think Gines gets out of it is that Gines is honoring this tradition. He's honoring his people. He's honoring his family. He's honoring his past. And what Lily gets out of it is interesting. She begins to respect something more, I think, about her dad. She begins to understand better the burden of time upon him.
Oh, it's also, by the way, should have another character. It was Jamie Cockrell. He enters her life. He's already been married and I guess divorced, although he has a young child named Belle. What role do you see him playing in this transition that Lily seems to be making?
Well, Jamie and Lily grew up together. They were best friends growing up, and And actually, when Giles wasn't a very good dad, Lily spent a lot of time living in Jamie's house, sort of being nurtured by Jamie's mom, Mary Virginia, who's a pretty funny character in and of herself. So part of her reluctance to come back to Ophelia has to do with seeing Jamie again, because she, probably has loved him her whole life, but she walked away. She pulled herself away from him because as she grew older, became a teenager, it embarrassed her, her situation. She felt kind of embarrassed and kind of mortified by the fact that she was kind of this outcast. So, when she comes back, she's intrigued to see him again, but also very nervous about seeing him again. And I guess the role that Jamie plays, besides being, this gorgeous,
Right.
handsome young waterman, is that fact that he actually does want to continue the life. He wants to be a waterman, and not many young people do want to be watermen anymore. But he loves the life. He loves being out on the river, on the bay. He doesn't have the opportunity to do it because his father, who was a waterman and owned the licenses, is no longer around. And so Lily comes up with this idea. Once Giles can't go out on the water anymore, she says, maybe you should ask Giles if you could lease the Jenny Ray, his boat, and fish his traps. Which at first seems like a crazy idea, but he asks, and Giles says yes. So he represents to me, obviously a potential future of someone who pays homage and respects, the way of life, and wants to figure out a way to make it work going forward. Is not willing to just walk away from this community and this way of life.
And then, of course, we have Kenneth Rayleigh, who has worked with Giles, I guess, for many, many years, and he's left out in the cold. He seems like as if somehow his efforts are not appreciated. And how does he fit? How does he fit into this in that sense? And do we get any sense about how he resolves that with the idea that it's Jamie's the guy, not me?
From Kenneth?
Yeah. Or does he accept it at all? I mean,
I think Kenneth in the end does accept it, and he accepts it because he realizes that he was never willing to be responsible enough to earn the trust necessary for someone like Giles to give him his whole life, his boat that he built, his licenses, everything. I mean, Kenneth has worked with Giles for a long time, but he's got an alcohol problem. He's not very trustworthy, and he's loyal, but he's not very trustworthy, and they're two different things. And Giles is unwilling to, Giles feels that Kenneth is too willing to take the shortcut. He's not willing to really care deeply about something. And, at his core, Giles cares deeply, deeply, deeply about these things. So he's not going to just hand it off to Kenneth.
and of course we have Belle. What do you think she represents? I mean, she's very precocious and.
Mm-hmm. I guess, Belle for me I kind of modeled her a little bit after my daughter.
Oh, okay.
Who was very precocious, and when I was writing the book, she was, I guess, about this age, maybe a little bit younger. I love the idea of young people who can just sort of see through adults' mess and sort of cut right to the heart of things, and Belle has this capability, and it's something that Lily really needs. And Lily also realizes by spending time with Belle that actually maybe she's not so closed off as she thinks she is. I mean, one of the things that Jamie says to her is, when he had Belle, his heart cracked wide open, and that's okay, and that's. To be a full human being, you have to allow that to happen to yourself. And it's Lily's burden to learn this. I mean, that's part of, her journey in the story is essentially learning this, allowing her heart to be cracked open, allowing pain back in, and also joy. So Belle represents that idea.
Well, because one of the things that struck me was this idea of perfection. I think there's at one point giants talk about giants had yearned for something perfect, that he had grasped it so briefly and then lost it before he understood the simple truth that it didn't need to be, that is, need to be perfect. And Lily seems to be come to this same conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, Lily's really mad at him. I mean, she's very she's got a pretty big chip on her shoulder. You know, she's got a little bit of the victim thing going on. You know, my youth was horrible. My father was a freak and horrible man and cold. And she says to Jamie at one point, I would have been better off, or no, not Jamie, another character. I would have been better off being raised by a dog pack. You know, she really has to. She has to. I'm sorry, I kind of lost the track of that.
That's right.
That,
But I mean, this whole idea about searching for perfection.
Yeah. Yeah, like she, you know, she had this idea in her head about what a father-daughter relationship should be. You know, what you should have been this. It's, you know, and it's sort of about expectations and what we expect of people versus what they can actually deliver. And in the end, you know, she very much wants Giles to do a particular thing, to go in a particular direction, and he simply can't. And she has to accept that and still realize that, you know, she loves the man and he loves her, and it's okay.
Because as a matter of fact, there's, I think, at one moment where they're building the boat, and basically he's telling her, she's realizing that there's this beauty in the imperfection of the wood itself.
Right. There's an area in the boat where she's made a mistake. She was really angry with him. She's having this discussion again about selling the land, and, you know, you have to come, you know, she's trying to make her case to him. He's discovered now that she actually went behind his back.
Right.
And she went far enough with this realtor to have a perk test done on a piece of, you know, land off to the side, and she's sort of progressing with this idea, thinking that if she gets the ball rolling far enough, then she presents it to Giles and he can't say no. Which, of course, is not what happens. You know, Giles is no fool. He figures it out, and he says, no. You know, no, I'm not budging on this. I never was going to budge on it. And at that point, she's trying to fit this particular piece in the skiff, and she's getting all distracted, and she makes a mistake, and it's no good, and she starts to rail against this, you know, about I have to take it out, I have to fix it. And he said, no. He's like, we can fix this. This is not, it's okay. It's okay that it's not perfect. You know, we can work with this, and that's part of what she's learning.
And it seems to me that translates into the relationships, or she realizes that you don't have perfect relationships.
Right, it's impossible.
Yeah. So how do we assess then the relationship between her and Jamie? Is that going to be a perfect relationship? I know I'm asking what happens.
What happens next? You know, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's going to be a pretty great relationship, but I don't think any relationship is perfect. And I really think that, you know, as adults, we all have to understand that we're flawed. You know, human beings are flawed, and I think loving somebody is understanding the flaws and accepting the flaws and then working together on other things. So I think that's what she's going to have to do.
So, do you see this way of life disappearing? I mean, you've written about it a lot. Certainly on the Western Shore, we see it's certainly true here on the Eastern Shore. Deal Island, I think, is one of those classic examples where you see the young people don't stay. Although there are some people, for instance, the Skipjacks. You know, there are some young people who are picking up the trade, but a lot of them are leaving. It's just too hard of a life. Yeah,
I think it is. I think it's up against enormous challenges, not the least financial.
Right.
You know, trying to maintain any kind of boat is expensive. Trying to maintain a working boat is expensive. You know, as watermen are at the whim of nature. And any occupation that's at the whim of nature, whether you're a farmer or a waterman, means that you're taking a risk every time you know, every season. So I don't know. You know, I'm not going to sit here and be the one to say yes, it's all going away. I certainly feel like in my time on the Chesapeake, I've seen enormous change in the nature of the waterfront, even just in marinas and how they're run, and certainly in communities like Rock Hall, that used to be almost all watermen and is now pretty much almost all recreational. When I first came back to Annapolis in 1989 in the wintertime, in City Dock, all the oyster tonging boats would be docked in there in the wintertime. They allowed them to all raft up along the City Dock in the winter, and it was a beautiful thing. You'd come through town and it would be snowing, and there'd be all these beautiful dead rise workboats, which I just love. I mean, they're just gorgeous boats. And that gives you a sense of place, of what this place values. Well, that's gone. They're not the workboats aren't in City Dock anymore ever. I think there's one working dead rise coming out of that area now, and City Dock is full of recreational boats now. So to me, that's a very visual representation of the cultural shift that's taken place even just in the last 25 years in Annapolis.
Do you think we've lost something?
Yeah.
What do you think that is? I mean, because I say that because I know I said this actually to somebody else who'd done something on the Skipjack, and one of the things that struck me coming from the West is that the watermen remind me of cowboys. That is that they're extremely independent. They've got their horse. They go from drive to drive. They're very, very independent individuals. And it seemed to me that when I look out particularly at the watermen and particularly the Skipjack and Skipjack captains, that they seem to have the same kind of characteristics.
Yeah, I think I suffer from a danger of being nostalgic about
Yeah.
stuff like this, and so I know that life is brutally hard. Mm-hmm. The reality is it's brutally hard. It's worth it to people, obviously. And, Gines is an interesting character because even though he's kind of this hard-shelled, hardcore waterman, he absolutely loves nature. He's curious about it. The idea of being a person of water and sky is very natural to him. And I think, I don't know if all watermen feel that way. Although, I've certainly read a lot about, how it's important to them to be able to be out there every day, to see that horizon, to be part of that world. So do I think the Chesapeake Bay as a larger community is losing something valuable? Yeah, I definitely do. I do. I know I can suffer from nostalgia, but I do feel that way. I don't want it to become corporate and plastic. I want it to remain, parts of it at least, I hope can remain sort of more traditional and respectful of these ways of life that are absolutely part of what makes the Bay what it is.
But you obviously spent some time on the water with watermen and so on. What kind of personal feel do you get about being out there?
You mean me out there?
Mm-hmm. And and perhaps
Yeah, well, I grew up on the water.
Okay.
Not as a waterman, of course, not in a waterman's family, but I'm one of those recreational people. My parents had a boat on the Sassafras River from when I was a little kid, and we were what's called the Pennsylvania Navy. Every weekend, the Pennsylvania Navy descends upon the northern Chesapeake and comes into all the marinas, and so we're part of the problem, I suppose, if you could call it that. But being on the Chesapeake Bay, being in part of everything that makes it what it is, from an ecological standpoint, its natural beauty has always been a huge part of my life. So, and it's always it's always been an enormous part of my writing. I'm not executive editor of Chesapeake Bay Magazine anymore.
Right.
That's been a while back, but I still write columns for them on occasion. And I still write about the Bay all the time, and it's always centered in the physical beauty of the Bay, the natural beauty of the Bay. I just feel much better when I'm out there.
Is there another book? Another fictional book?
People have asked me if I'd write a sequel, and
That's true too.
and
Well, what happened to Jamie
yeah.
and Lily, right?
Right. I don't even know if I have that in me.
Was it tough? What kind of difference was there in writing a book like this, in which basically, I mean, obviously you've got a lot of information or experiences you're drawing upon, as opposed to say something that's nonfiction, which you get all the dates
Right.
and figures. I mean, they're
Well, parts of this book I approached it very much as nonfiction. For instance, the boat building part,
Right.
The pound fishing part, any part that had to do specifically with a specific sort of tradition or craft that I wanted to describe was very much I approached it from a nonfiction point of view. That's why I spent all that time with George Butler. I wanted to make sure I got it right. But writing fiction is hard. I find it to be sort of like jumping off a cliff every morning. And sometimes it's really exciting because some things will fall into place and you just can't believe how that happened. But it took a lot of time. I actually left the magazine, and my husband, who was owned a boatyard at that time, said to me, the kids were little. He said, "Why don't you go ahead and leave the magazine? I'll take care of stuff, and you work on this book," which was extraordinary of him to do that. So I would get up in the morning, I'd take the kids to elementary school, and then I'd come home and I'd sit down for 4 or 5 hours, whatever the period of time it was, and I would just work on it. I took classes at the Writer Center in Bethesda and learned a lot there. I did get to go to Breadloaf twice and learned an enormous amount there. And then I developed a very small writers group of 3 other writers. One was a Breadloaf alum, and 2 I met through the Writer Center, and we would meet once a month in D.C. and critique each other's work. So they basically, they helped this novel be born because they, from the start to the finish, they were part of it. Not fiction writing's a pretty lonely process, so I enjoyed having people to tell me I wasn't crazy and that what I was doing was okay.
and there seems to, in this particular book, and it's the kind of book I like, is that the characters, but you really do get a sense of what's going on inside their head. I mean, how was that more difficult, do you think? I mean, how difficult was that to get in? Because there was a lot of layering of, from moment to moment and sort of looking at the world through these people's eyes.
Yeah, Gines and his point of view and his voice was very strong in me right from the beginning, and that's probably because the core of the story came from that original interview, which, by the way, I should say that Walter Colesbros was a much nicer man than Gines.
Okay, but put that on the record.
Yeah. He had the only thing they had in common was that they, in the area that they lived, what they did for a living,
Right.
and the fact that they both lost their wives. The first version of the book, his voice was a lot stronger, and his motivation seemed quite clear to me. Lily's not so much. She was a little too simple when I first wrote it. So when I came back to it a couple of years later,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I had learned some things, and I needed to change the ending a little bit. And I better understood her and her motivation. The other thing that I did was I had the first draft of the novel coached by a woman I met at the Writer's Center, a teacher there named Barbara Estman. And she's a terrific writer, terrific coach, and she also felt that the character of Lily needed some more explanation. Why is she doing what she's doing? So when I came back to rewrite, I focused more on Lily and her voice, and as I got to know her better, her motivations became more clear.
How long, by the way, did it take you to write it?
The initial draft, I have sort of been thinking back on it now, and I'm going to say it was probably 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit more than that. Pretty consistent work. And then I put it away for about 3 years because my family and I took off on our boat and went sailing full time for 4.5 years. So I was really busy navigating, homeschooling, doing all that stuff, cooking.
Right.
But then the last year that we were out, I learned about a contest, a creative writing contest for unpublished first novels. And I thought, maybe I could submit it.
Right.
And at the same time, I knew, and that was sort of what prompted me to go back through what Barbara had said, go back about how I was thinking about Lily. And again, my husband said, okay, I'll take care of homeschooling the kids. You use that time to go back and do the rewrite. So that's what I did. And so I guess if you add that time into it, that was another year.
Every year.
By the time, I don't think I can really even quantify it.
It's a long process.
Yeah, and I would love to say that I could become a full-time fiction writer. I'm not sure it's my strongest writing, It's a way for me as a writer to flex a lot of muscles, new ones, try something I've never done, challenge myself. I'm doing the same thing with poetry now. So I'm really enjoying that. It's the exact opposite of all these words.
Right. It's
highly compressed.
Concise. That's right.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of prosed out for a while. So poetry's been really, really great. But again, it's the same idea. I feel like as a writer, it's really good to try different things all the time and challenge yourself.
We've been speaking with Wendy Clark. She is author of a new novel called Stillwater Bending about a waterman and his daughter. And we do appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.